The rain had just stopped. Neon lights reflected off the wet pavement as people moved in and out of the rundown downtown bar. It wasn't the kind of place tourists visited. This was where deals were whispered, debts were collected, and respect was enforced the hard way. Steven Seagal stepped inside quietly. No bodyguards. No flashy clothes. Just a black jacket, worn boots, and a calm, unreadable expression. He took a seat near the back, away from the noise, ordered a drink, and kept his eyes low. To anyone watching, he looked like just another middle-aged man trying to disappear into the shadows. That's when the laughter started. At the center table sat 4 men, expensive watches, loud voices, cruel smiles. Everyone in the bar knew them. Local gangsters. The kind people avoided eye contact with. The kind who enjoyed reminding others who was in control. One of them noticed Steven. He nudged the man beside him and smirked. "Hey, look at this guy," he said loudly. Steven didn't react. The gangster stood up, slowly walked over, and looked Steven up and down with open disgust. "You lost, old man," he sneered. "This isn't a shelter." A few people chuckled nervously. No one spoke up. Steven calmly lifted his glass and took a sip. That calm only irritated them more. Another gangster joined in, grabbing a chair and sitting backwards in front of Steven. "You deaf? Or just stupid?" Steven finally looked up. His eyes were calm. Too calm. "I'm just here for a drink," he said quietly. That was the wrong answer. The first gangster slapped the glass out of Steven's hand. It shattered on the floor. The bar went silent. "You don't talk unless we say you can," the man snapped. "You don't sit where you want. You sit where you're allowed." Steven glanced down at the broken glass, then back up, still calm. That's when the leader arrived, bigger than the rest. Colder eyes. No shouting, just authority. He stood behind Steven and spoke softly, almost kindly. "You know what I hate? Men who think they're invisible." He leaned closer. "This is our place. Our city. Our rules." Steven slowly stood up. For a brief second, the gangsters thought he was about to apologize. Instead, he straightened his jacket and said something that made the leader pause. "You should let this go." The leader laughed. A sharp, cruel laugh. "And what happens if I don't?" Steven looked around the room, at the frightened bartender, the frozen crowd, the exits. Then he met the gangsters' eyes again. "Then you're going to regret tonight." The gangsters burst out laughing. None of them had any idea. They weren't humiliating a nobody. They were standing inches away from a man who had survived things far worse than them. And what happened next would change every life in that room forever. The laughter didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder. The gangsters had surrounded Steven now. 5 of them, maybe 6, forming a loose circle as if it were a game. A cruel one. Their leader, a thick-necked man with gold rings on every finger, stepped closer until he was almost chest to chest with him. "You hear that?" the man sneered. "Nobody talks to you like that," and walks away. Steven didn't respond. He simply stood there, calm, almost attached. His eyes moved slowly from face to face, not in fear, but as if he were counting something, measuring distance, timing. Wait. The leader mistook the silence for weakness. Big mistake. One of the gangsters shoved Steven's shoulder hard. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man." Steven took half a step back to keep his balance. Not because he was hurt, but because he chose to. The crowd nearby gasped softly. Phones were already coming out. People sensed something ugly was about to happen. The leader laughed again. "Look at him," he said to his crew. "Can barely stand." He reached out and flicked Steven's jacket with 2 fingers. "Nice coat. Bet you stole it." Steven finally spoke. "Step back." His voice was low, calm, no anger, no threat, just a statement. That should have been the end of it. But humiliation was a point. The leader leaned in closer, his breath heavy with alcohol. "Or what?" he whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You gonna cry?" One of the gangsters slapped Steven's hat off his head. It hit the ground and rolled. The crowd froze. That moment, that single act, changed the air. Steven slowly looked down at the hat on the pavement. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He simply stared at it for a second longer than necessary, as if something inside him had clicked into place. Behind him, a woman whispered, "Someone call the police." Another voice replied, "They are the problem." The leader grinned, sensing total control now. "You see? Nobody's coming to save you." He nodded to one of his men. The gangster grabbed Steven by the collar and yanked him forward. "Say sorry," he demanded. "Say it loud." Steven's hands were still at his sides. Relaxed. Too relaxed. Steven raised his eyes, not to the man holding him, but to the leader. "You shouldn't touch people," he said quietly. "It leads to consequences." The leader burst out laughing. "Listen to this guy." He turned to the crowd. "Hey, you all hearing this?" More phones lifted. Steven could feel it now. The shift, the tension tightening like a wire pulled too far. The gangsters were enjoying the spectacle, unaware that they were pushing past a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. The man gripping Steven's collar squeezed harder. "What consequences?" he mocked. Steven exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, the kind taken by someone who has lived through violence and survived it. "You're about to find out," Steven said. The leader waved his hand dismissively. "Enough talk." He stepped back and gave a single nod. That nod wasn't loud, but it was an order, and every gangster around them understood exactly what it meant. The crowd began to back away, because something was coming, and nobody, not one of them, realized that the man they were humiliating wasn't trapped in a circle with them. They were trapped in a circle with him. The room felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally. The music in the club had lowered, almost as if the DJ himself sensed something was wrong. Conversations around the room had faded into murmurs. People were watching without pretending anymore. Phones were out. Eyes were locked. The gangsters had stopped laughing. Not because Steven Seagal had said anything threatening, but because he hadn't. He stood there calmly, hands relaxed at his sides, posture loose, almost casual. No fear, no anger, just stillness. That kind of stillness makes dangerous men uneasy. The man with the scar, clearly the leader, stepped closer. He invaded Steven's personal space, chest almost touching him. "You think you're special?" the man said quietly, his voice low and venomous. "You think calm makes you strong?" Steven finally looked directly into his eyes. "I think actions matter more than noise," Steven replied. The leader smirked, but there was something forced about it. Around them, the gang members shifted. One cracked his knuckles. Another slid a hand inside his jacket. Not pulling anything out yet, just letting the threat exist. A woman near the bar whispered, "This is going to end badly." Steven heard it. Everyone did. One of the younger gangsters circled behind Steven, trying to intimidate him from the back. "You're surrounded, old man," the kid said. No cameras outside. No witnesses who matter. Steven turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. "You'd be surprised how many witnesses matter," he said calmly. The leader laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You talk like you've done this before." Steven didn't answer. That silence again. It pressed down on the group like weight. The leader gestured, and suddenly two gangsters grabbed Steven's arms, not violently yet, but firmly enough to test him. The crowd gasped. "Hey, let him go," someone shouted. The leader raised a hand without looking back. "Everyone relax," he said. "We're just teaching our guests some manners." Steven looked down at the hands gripping his arms, then back up. "You should let go," he said. The leader leaned in closer, whispering now. "Or what?" Steven's eyes hardened, not with rage, but with certainty. "Or you'll regret touching me." The leader pulled back, studying him. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. Just for a second. Then pride took over. He nodded once. "Do it." The grip tightened. What happened next was subtle, almost invisible. Steven shifted his weight. Not fast, not flashy, just right. In less than a heartbeat, the man holding his left arm cried out, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle. The other man stumbled forward as Steven stepped inside his balance, and gently, almost politely, guided him face first into the floor. No punches, no wild moves, just precision. The entire room froze. The leader's smile vanished. The younger gangsters stepped back instinctively. Steven released the injured man and took a step away, giving them space, as if they needed protection. "I warned you," he said quietly. The man on the floor groaned, clutching his wrist. "You broke it," he whispered. Steven shook his head. "No," he replied. "I spared it." That's when real fear entered the room. The leader raised his hand again, but this time his voice lacked confidence. Who are you?" Steven looked around at the faces staring at him. Shocked, confused, terrified. "I'm someone who doesn't enjoy violence," he said, "but I'm very familiar with it." Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, maybe unrelated, maybe not, but the sound made everyone tense. The leader swallowed. "You don't belong here," he said. Steven nodded slowly. "Neither do bullies." For a moment, it looked like the gang might rush him anyway. Pride pushing past reason. But something stopped them. Maybe it was the injured man on the floor. Maybe it was Steven's calm. Or maybe it was a sudden realization that they weren't dealing with an ordinary victim. The leader stepped back. "This isn't over," he muttered. Steven met his eyes one last time. "It never is," he said. And as the gang slowly retreated, the crowd erupted into whispered disbelief. "Did you see that?" He didn't even try. "Who is that guy?" Steven adjusted his jacket, checked on a shaken bystander nearby, and calmly walked toward the exit. Unaware that the truth about who he really was about to surface, the restaurant was no longer loud. It wasn't because the music stopped. It wasn't because the food stopped sizzling in the kitchen. It was because everyone felt it, that invisible shift when power quietly changes hands. Steven Seagal slowly placed his glass on the table. Clink. The sound was soft, but in the silence, it landed like a gunshot. The leader of the gang, a thick-necked man with scars slicing across his eyebrow, finally stopped smiling. Something about Steven's stillness bothered him. Not fear, not anger, control. "You deaf?" the gangster said, forcing a laugh. "I said stand up." Steven didn't move. Instead, he calmly straightened the sleeve of his jacket, deliberate, unhurried, as if the men surrounding him didn't exist. That's when one of the younger gang members leaned closer and whispered into the leader's ear. His voice was low, nervous. "I've seen this guy before." The leader tilted his head. "Seen him where?" The younger man swallowed. "Back east years ago. Different name, different place." Steven's eyes flicked toward them. Just for a second. Enough. The leader noticed. "Hey!" he snapped, pointing at Steven. "You got something to say?" Steven finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. That made it worse. "You should leave," Steven said calmly. "Now." A few customers gasped. The leader burst out laughing. Too loudly. "You hear this?" he shouted to his crew. "He's giving orders now." But the laughter didn't spread. Two of the gang members shifted uncomfortably. One of them took a step back, unconsciously. Steven stood up, slowly. No sudden movements. No aggression. Just a man rising to his full height. The room felt smaller. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," Steven continued. "But you brought it to my table." The leader clenched his jaw. "You think you're tough?" he sneered. "You think you scare us?" Steven met his eyes. "I don't scare people," he replied. "I end problems." That was when a man at the bar, older, grizzled, with eyes that had seen violence before, froze mid-sip. His glass trembled. He stared at Steven like he'd seen a ghost. "No," he muttered. "It can't be." He stood abruptly, knocking his stool over. The entire room turned. "That's him," the man said, voice shaking. "That's the man they used to call when things went bad." The leader's smile finally faded. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. The man swallowed hard. "Back in the day, when gangs disappeared, when no one ever found the bodies." Steven closed his eyes briefly. A warning, but it was too late. "That man," the stranger continued, pointing, "wasn't a gangster. He was worse." The leader took a step back now. Just one. Shut up, he barked. Steven opened his eyes. Cold. Focused. Last chance, Steven said quietly. The leader looked around, realizing for the first time that the crowd wasn't on his side anymore. Phones were out. Faces were pale. One of his own men whispered, "Boss, maybe we should go." The leader's pride flared. He reached for Steven's collar. That was a mistake. Steven moved. Not fast. Precise. In one smooth motion, he twisted the man's wrist. A sharp crack echoed through the room. The leader screamed and dropped to his knees. Steven leaned down, his voice barely above a whisper. "You came to humiliate me," he said. "Now walk away before you embarrass yourself further." The gang dragged their leader back, panic replacing arrogance. They fled. The door slammed shut. Silence. Steven adjusted his jacket, picked up his glass, and sat back down as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that restaurant knew one thing. They hadn't just witnessed intimidation. They had witnessed restraint from a man capable of far worse. The room had changed. Not in size, not in lighting, but in energy. What started as loud laughter and cheap dominance had now turned into something colder, heavier. The gangsters no longer joked. They watched, carefully. Steven stood exactly where he had been moments ago. Same calm posture, same relaxed shoulders, same unreadable expression. But now, everyone felt it. The leader, Marco, leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the table. His grin had faded. The insult he had thrown earlier didn't land the way he expected. Steven hadn't reacted like a victim. Victims flinch. Victims plead. Victims explain. Steven did none of that. Marco nodded subtly. Two men stepped closer, flanking Steven from both sides. Big, scarred. The kind of men who had ended arguments with fists and knives their entire lives. One of them cracked his knuckles loudly. "You real quiet for someone who was just embarrassed," the man growled. Steven finally lifted his eyes. Not quickly, not aggressively. Just enough to meet the man's gaze. "You mistake silence for weakness," Steven said evenly. The room went still. That sentence wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. But it landed. Marco leaned forward. "You got nerve," he said. "Most men don't talk like that in my place." Steven glanced around the room slowly. The exits, the corners, the men pretending to relax while gripping weapons under jackets. "I know exactly where I am," Steven replied, "and exactly who I'm standing with." That caught Marco's attention. "You don't look scared," Marco said. "I don't scare easily," Steven answered. A few of the gangsters shifted uncomfortably. Marco studied him now, really studied him. The scars on Steven's knuckles. The way he stood slightly angled, never fully square to anyone. The way his hands hung loose, not tense. That wasn't arrogance. That was experience. Marco smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "All right," he said. "Let's play a game." He snapped his fingers. One of the men shoved Steven hard in the chest. Steven moved, but not backward. He absorbed the push, pivoted half a step, and the man stumbled forward instead, confused. It happened so fast most of them didn't even realize what they'd seen. The room froze. The man turned, anger flashing across his face. "You think you're funny?" Steven sighed, a small, disappointed sound. "No," he said quietly. "I think you're sloppy." That was the moment. Marco stood up slowly. "You just crossed a line," he said coldly. Steven nodded once. "Yes," he said. "You did." Before Marco could speak again, Steven moved. Not explosively, not dramatically. Efficiently, he stepped inside the man's reach, redirected an incoming punch with sharp wrist turn, and dropped the man to his knees with precise strike to the nerve behind the jaw. The sound wasn't loud, but the effect was immediate. Another gangster rushed in. Steven sidestepped, hooked the arm, and drove the man face first into the table. Wood cracked. Glass shattered. The room erupted. Chairs scraped. Men shouted. Guns began to rise. Steven raised one hand. "Stop," he said. His voice cut through the chaos like steel. And something strange happened. They hesitated. Marco's eyes widened just slightly. This wasn't a bar brawl. This wasn't intimidation. This was a man who knew exactly how much damage he could do, and was choosing restraint. Steven looked straight at Marco. "You wanted to humiliate me," he said calmly, "to feel powerful." He took a step forward. "But power," Steven continued, "is knowing you don't need to prove anything." Marco swallowed. "You don't know who you're talking to," Marco said. Steven tilted his head. "That's where you're wrong," he replied. "I know exactly who you are." He gestured around the room. "And I know how fragile this whole operation really is." Silence. Steven leaned closer, voice low. "Because I've dismantled organizations like yours before. Men louder than you, smarter than you, crueler than you." Marco's face had gone pale. "Who are you?" he whispered. Steven straightened. "Someone you should have let walk out." No one moved. Not because they were afraid of violence anymore, but because they were afraid of what he knew. And for the first time that night, Marco realized something terrifying. This man wasn't trapped in the room with them. They were trapped in the room with him. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Not peaceful. Not calm. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something irreversible happens. The gang leader lay groaning on the floor, clutching his arm, his face twisted in disbelief. His men stood frozen, not because they were afraid of the police, but because they no longer understood the man standing in front of them. Steven Seagal straightened his jacket calmly. No heavy breathing, no rage, no celebration, just control. One of the younger gang members took a step back, whispering, "Boss, that guy's not normal." The leader looked up at Steven with bloodshot eyes. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled. "You don't fight like a civilian." Steven met his gaze, cold, steady, unreadable. "I never said I was one." That single sentence hit harder than any punch. The door to the warehouse creaked open. Everyone turned. A tall man in a security jacket stepped inside slowly. His eyes widened the moment he saw Steven. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. The gang leader noticed. "You know him?" The guard swallowed. "You really don't?" Steven didn't stop him. The guard spoke anyway, his voice shaking. "That's Steven Seagal." The name didn't land immediately, so the guard continued. "Former special operations consultant, trained military units, worked with elite forces. The man you tried to humiliate." He paused. "He's ended fights before they even started." The room erupted. "That's bulls." "No way." "He's lying." Steven raised one hand. Silence returned instantly. "You don't need to believe him," Steven said calmly. "But ask yourself something." He slowly looked at each gangster, one by one. "If I wanted to hurt you, do you really think you'd still be standing?" No one answered. The gang leader tried to stand, and failed. He winced, fear now replacing arrogance. "You set this up," he growled. "You wanted us to react." Steven nodded slightly. "Yes." "Why?" Steven stepped closer, his voice low but powerful. "Because men like you mistake patience for weakness, and humility for fear." He leaned in just enough for the leader to hear. "I wanted you to show your true nature, without me saying a word." Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called it in. Panic spread. "Cops! We gotta go." But Steven didn't move. He looked at the gang leader one last time. "You tried to humiliate me in front of strangers," he said. "Tonight, you learned something far more expensive." Police flooded the warehouse minutes later. Weapons dropped. Hands raised. Faces pale. As officers cuffed the gang members, one officer paused in front of Steven. "Sir, are you all right?" Steven nodded. "I am." The officer hesitated. "We'll need a statement." Steven gave one calm sentence. "Make sure they learn the difference between strength and cruelty." As Steven walked out into the cold night air, phones were already out, videos uploaded, clips spreading, comments exploding. People weren't cheering violence. They were cheering restraint. What would you have done in Steven's place? Comment below. Your opinion matters. The alley didn't feel the same anymore. Just minutes ago, it had been a place of fear, Raised voices, cracked knuckles, and men who believed power came from numbers and guns. Now it was silent. The gangsters stood frozen, some leaning against the brick wall, others staring at the ground, their confidence shattered. The leader, the same man who had laughed first, who had tried to humiliate Steven, now couldn't even meet his eyes. Steven Seagal adjusted his jacket calmly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No heavy breathing, no victory pose, no anger, just stillness. Police sirens echoed faintly in the distance. One of the younger gang members swallowed hard. He didn't even raise his voice, he whispered, barely audible. The leader finally spoke. His voice cracked. "We didn't know," he muttered. "If we had—" Steven raised one hand. Not aggressively, not threateningly. "Stop," he said calmly. The word carried more weight than any shout. "This isn't about who I am," Steven continued, his tone steady. "It's about who you chose to be tonight." The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. Steven stepped closer, not invading space, not intimidating, just close enough to be heard clearly. "You thought humiliation made you powerful," Steven said. "You thought fear earned you respect. But look around." The gang members shifted uncomfortably. "Fear fades," Steven went on. "Respect stays. And tonight you earned neither." The sirens grew louder now. Somewhere nearby, people had gathered, shop owners, late-night workers, strangers who had heard the noise. Phones were raised. Whispers spread. "That's him. Is that really Steven Seagal? I heard he used to be Special Forces. They say he's untouchable." Steven turned slightly, addressing the crowd without performing for them. "This story will travel," he said calmly, "not because of violence, but because of choice." The police cars arrived. Officers stepped out, hands ready, until they saw the scene. Gang members lined against the wall, weapons on the ground. Steven Seagal standing calm at the center. One officer approached cautiously. "Sir, are you hurt?" Steven shook his head. "No." Another officer recognized him instantly, eyes widening. "Sir, we'll take it from here." The gang leader looked defeated now, not just arrested, but exposed. His illusion of control was gone. As the gang members were taken away, one of them turned back. "Why didn't you finish us?" he asked quietly. Steven paused. "Because the goal isn't to destroy people," he replied. "It's to stop them from destroying others." The man looked away, ashamed. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Clips from different angles. Comments flooding in by the thousands. That calm was terrifying. He didn't act like a killer. That's what made it real. True strength is restraint. They tried to humiliate the wrong man. News outlets picked it up, carefully calling it a fictional dramatized account, but the message was loud and clear. Steven Seagal trended worldwide, not as an action star, not as a legend, but as a symbol of something rare: composure. In an interview later that day, a reporter asked, "Do you think they'll ever change?" Steven answered honestly. "I don't know," he said, "but I know this. Every moment gives us a choice. Tonight, I made mine." The clip ended there. No threats, no boasts, no celebration. Just truth. If you were in Steven's place, would you have reacted with anger or control? Comment control if you believe real power comes from restraint. Comment respect if you believe no one has a right to humiliate another. And if you enjoy fictional stories with powerful life lessons, like, share, subscribe, because the next story might change how you see strength forever.